All right. Happy October, everyone. Hope you all are staying safe and healthy. My name is Steve Romig. For those of you who don't know me, I'm your host for these monthly DIGFM meetings, coming to you from beautiful Campbell, California. I think I only have one housekeeping announcement before we get started, and that is when you logged in, you are automatically muted. And I'd recommend that you keep yourself muted in this day and age when we're all at home with the sounds of leaf blowers, TV, kids playing Fortnite, other ambient sounds. It can be pretty distracting, not only for the presenter, but for those of us who are listening. However, if you want to say something, here's a little WebEx tip from me to you. Simply press and hold the space bar to temporarily unmute yourself. Say what you want to say, and then when you release the space bar, you'll mute yourself again. So you don't have to go searching around for the mute button if you want to say something. Other than that, sit back and relax as we hear about the philosophy of FileMaker from John Mark Osborne. Now, for those historians out there, John Mark and I were part of Claris when Claris was Claris the first time. Some of you on the call might have had the pleasure of talking to John Mark or myself on the phone if you called into Claris technical support with your, at the time, super complicated FileMaker Pro 2.1 solutions. In fact, before we started here, I heard somebody mentioning that they had a 50-plus solution built in FileMaker 2. So there is also a pretty good chance that one of us fired a Nerf arrow at the other one during that time too. Anyway, without further ado, I will pass things on to John Mark.
Thanks. I appreciate Steve, and it's good to see everybody here. I actually met Stephen Blackwell on tech support, and he'll still tell the story to this day about how I solved his AppleScript problem. I really honestly had no idea what he was talking about on the phone. And I just went into Tech Info, which was what it was called then. It's called the knowledge base. I'm not sure what they're calling it on the Claris website right now. And I just did a search because I had listened to him. I just didn't know what he was talking about. I'm like, oh, here, this will probably solve your problem. Sent it to him. And it was 25 years ago and he still remembers it and still tells me the story. So I was trying to think about how to introduce myself. And I just figured out I'm just really a bunch of URLs. And I'm going to try to keep this short. I really don't like slides at all. I hate them. In fact, when I used to present at DevCon, I'd do my slides in a FileMaker database so I could have I like to get into the solutions and play around with them and do all kinds of stuff like that. But I'm going to tell you about myself as a URL. So again, I don't like slides. I'm going to spend just a few minutes here, tell you a little bit about myself so you know who I am, and just to market my services a little bit. Now, most of these websites that are here are still active. Some are not, but most of them do have something for free. So it's not total marketing. You can get something from there. So I really started off my FileMaker career, and I don't even know if Eric knows this. I started working at San Jose State University as an assistant, and they threw me out a FileMaker database and said, fix it. And that's kind of how I started. After that, I really didn't like school that much, especially getting a master's. So I especially hated, doing any kind of math and stuff like that. So I got out of that pretty quick and went to work at Apple. I worked in their customer service department. Then I got a job at Claris 1.0. Somebody's asking to annotate. I'm just going to decline it. I don't know what this is. And while I was working at Claris, I started my website, databasepros.com, and it was just static HTML back then. And I did it because I love FileMaker. I mean, I had no idea I was going to love it when I started working there, but it was absolutely my favorite program. And so I started a website and started sharing stuff, and it eventually became a FileMaker backend and all that kind of stuff. I met Matt Petrowski through Jane Reeder, which probably nobody knows who Jane Reeder is, but she was a manager over at Claris 1.0. And she introduced me to Matt and said, I think you guys would get along. And we went and, basically I started working for him. We did the Everything CD, as you can see there, scriptology. I did the FileMaker magazine for a while. Yeah, let's see, there we go. And after ISO, which was probably about a year, I worked there. I worked at Mac Academy. Maybe you don't know that, they just do videos on it. I'm not even sure they're in business anymore. I worked at Macworld for about a decade, doing presentations there. VTC, which imploded. It's kind of an interesting story about VTC. They fired everybody about 10 years ago and moved their operations to the Philippines because they thought they could save money. But what instead happened was everything just got terrible there, and it became one of those kinds of stories that you think that you can move everything across over to a foreign land, and it'll be it'll work out better. And this definitely did not. They're gone. So that's when I started doing my own videos. I worked for a FileMaker advisor for a long time, did the tips and tricks. That's now defunct. I guess I'm the kiss of death. I don't know. I do my videos on philosophyofFileMaker.thinkific.com right now. I also have a blog site, philosophyofFileMaker.com, which most of the material is coming from here. I mean, it comes from all of them. I mean, the material's everywhere, but really, if you want to see these, more write-up on all the stuff I'm presenting, it's all on that website, and it's free. And then most recently, we've been doing Fireside FileMaker with Michael Richard. Pretty cool little podcast where we just sit around and talk as if we're around a fire pit, just hanging out and stuff like that. This presentation is geared towards intermediate advanced developer. What that means, it's hard to say. I know there's a lot of experts here. I've seen you come in. I'm not sure how much I can teach you. Maybe there'll be a little nugget of truth here and there, but I'm hoping the experts will help me out and say, hey, you know what, I did this on this situation, and maybe we can make it so that we can get several presenters here and see what we can do. And then without further ado, we have the conditional tabs. We're going to cover those. Something I know some people have been doing for a while. I just learned about them. I love them, so I'm excited about them. Transactional processing, I'm going to talk about that, and record locking and stuff like that. And then also preferences, how to use ExecuteSQL. And if we have time, which I doubt, because I like to make sure it's real clear, I'm going to take it slow. But if we have some other examples if we need be. Now there is some example files here, but I'm going to keep them hidden so you don't download them right now, but you will have them, and I'll show that at the end again. The download. And if you missed that, just email me. I mean, it's pretty easy to find me to say, hey, I was at the DIGFM meeting. Can I get the download, which is right here, just the 3 files. Okay, everybody good? I don't know if everybody can even hear me, or I'll take that as, okay, good. I got something. I didn't quite hear it, but that's good. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about conditional tabs. I had a client, and they had a contact management section. It's actually probably 100 and some odd tables at this point, but one of the significant sections was a contact manager. And I think there's probably about 10 or 12 tabs inside there. And those tabs were conditional. I wanted them to be conditional. In fact, I even wrote Rick Coleman an email and said, hey, why can't I make tabs disappear? Why can't I make the tab control disappear? You can make a calculation, and what will happen is on the tab control, we're not talking about slide controls here, we'll get to those in a second, but on the tab control, if you make a calculation that says, hey, if I look at a field on this contact manager and this guy's in a certain category and he doesn't need this tab, well, I can make that tab really small, but I can't make it disappear, which is really what I wanted to do. And I kept telling my client there's nothing I can do until I talked to Michael Richard. Now, I know he didn't invent the technique. I don't know who did, but it's actually a really interesting technique. And I think that a lot of people probably know about it, but what I'm going to get into, which I think is the meat of this, is when to use it and when not to use it. So the way I like to do things is I have a finished file here, but I really want to go ahead and first demonstrate it, but then build it from scratch, because I think that's really the best way to learn. you know all the nuts and bolts of what's going on. You're not going, oh, what did he just do there? I'm going to do it right in front of your face. It's not going to be as complicated. You can certainly take this technique and, make it, specific for your solution. And each solution is going to need something a little bit different, more complexity or who knows what. But I want to break it down to the most simple parts, nothing fancy, so you understand the technique if you've never seen it before, and then you can look out on the internet or expand it to meet your needs. So we'll go ahead and get rid of this, or actually I said I was going to demonstrate it. So we have two categories here, personal and business. And so there's two records here. And you can see when I go to somebody with personal, we only have two tabs. And when we go to somebody with business, the other tab shows up. And it literally completely disappears, which is what my client wanted. They wanted, it just looks nice. Why would you want to have this little kind of sliver of a tab here? It's not that they could click on it and see anything, right? If they clicked on that sliver in the tab control, you would see, nothing in here. I could hide it with the hide control, but I couldn't actually hide the tab control. So what we needed to do was we needed a couple of things. We need slide controls, object naming, button bars, scripts, and hide object. Those 5 things, I may have forgotten something, we'll see. Okay, so we're going to go in here. I'm going to go blank, create. Call it tab, conditional. Okay, so I actually don't need any fields to make this happen, so I won't add them. I'm purposely trying to make this as simple as possible. I'm going to come in here, get my tab control just to show you what's going on here, and we'll make 1, 2, 3. Okay, so everybody knows how to do that, right? 1, 2, 3. It's easy. But if we come in here and we act like, and I'm not going to make a full-on calculation, I'm just going to make that. I'm going to rename it and make it just quote. And you'll notice that it's a calculation here. And when you go into browse mode, you'll see that you still get this little sliver. And that's what I don't like about tab controls. Tab controls, as we'll come back to the end of the presentation, are still my go-to. And I've had people tell me you should always use slide controls, but we'll find out why you might not want to use them. So that's my problem here. Let's go ahead and switch over here to the slide control. Toss on here. We've got 3, which is perfect here. It's exactly what we want. I'm going to put some text on here so it's really clear. Let's put in 1, 2. Oh, I love how Claris does that. I don't understand that. Why would ever do that? And then 3. But why, Steve, why does that happen? Talk to the people. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3, not very fancy. You can switch to them back and forth using this. And now the slide control itself is technically not going to be conditional. It's going to be the button bar here. And if you don't know about button bars, and I was always against them, like, why would I want a button bar? I would throw it up there. I'm like, I don't want all my buttons connected together. I don't want something like this. It looks terrible. I like space. I like negative space, white space between my buttons. And I never was sold on button bars for many, many versions. And I still really, in a lot of ways, don't like them because they're all connected together. But, of course, you can make it just one if you want, do something like that. And then you just have one. But, it just was kind of not my thing and not for the right reasons. Sometimes you just don't, you get old, you get over 50 and you decide, I'm just going to do it the old way, So that's kind of probably what it was. And we'll come up here and we'll say 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so now we have our buttons here. And what we want them to do is we want them to control this slide control here. So what we need to do is name the slide control. So I'm just going to simply go 1, go to each pane here, call this one 2. And then we'll go to 3. And then all we need to do is on each one of these guys here is come in and assign. And again, this is where you can get more sophisticated, more complicated. I'm not trying to do that kind of stuff. We're just going to do some go to objects. We're going to say, I'm just hard coding it right in here. Don't get anybody get on my case. I'm not trying to make it fancy. I'm just trying to go ahead and do it at the most basic level here. Okay. Go number 2. Single step. And we'll say 3. I think I got these right. I could have spelled something wrong. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, let's test it out real quick, make sure it works. 2, 3, 1. Good. So now we've got the basics working. We've got it moving around. And this, is pretty easy to do. And all this really is really easy to do. It's just a little bit more work than I like when you're working with a tab control. And I'm not going to pay attention to making it look nice here. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. If you want to try to make it look like a tab control at the end, we'll talk about that. But now what we want to do is, and actually I lied, we do need a field. So I'm going to go into Manage Database. And I always think of Script Maker and define fields. And we were talking on the podcast the other day. And we kept Mark Rochelle was there, and we're both old school, and Michael Sharp was there, and we're all using the old terminology, and we just can't get it out of our minds. But so let's go ahead and do category here. Just a simple text field. I'll toss that field over here. And let's see if we can make a little room. Go. It might not fit a radio button on here. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. We'll see. Okay, radio button. I'm sorry, apologize. Somebody's trying to call me. Let me disconnect them. Go. Okay, so we'll make in our little value list here, just like we did in the sample file. Okay, so there we go. Personal and business, we got that in there. And now we can come in here and get one record that's personal, one that's business. So now what we need to do is come in and take a look at these. The thing about a button bar that's really cool is you can click on each one of the buttons individually, even though they're connected to each other. So you can come in here and click on it a second time, and you'll see it highlight like that. And you can come in and say, hey, I want this one to disappear with hide object. So we'll decide that 2 is the one we don't want to see. We're going to come in here, we're going to say category equals personal, and that should make it disappear. So let's see what happens here. Hopefully it does work. And there you go. You can see how it's disappearing right there. Simple little trick. And then some of the things you want to do as far as interface will be to get rid of these navigation dots. I really don't want those on there. And possibly come in here and use the appearance to make these kind of meld together. Obviously make these buttons a little bit smaller, connect them to this, change the appearance. It takes a little bit of work, and you'll see when you look at the example file that, again, that I put together. Let's see if I can get it to open up. There we go. That they do appear to be tab controls. It doesn't appear to be anything but a tab control here. And so if you take the time, you can do it. I don't know if sometimes there's no point in actually doing that. So I think that's about it on this as far as technique. Oh, so let's talk about why I like this and why I don't like this, because that's really what the philosophy of FileMaker is about doing things like comparing and contrasting. Thinking outside the box, determining whether it's going to be speedier one technique or another technique. It's about thinking about what you're doing rather than just regurgitating. And I find a lot of people just go out on the internet, and I'm not talking about experts, I'm talking about people who may be just starting out with FileMaker, and they go out and see something really fancy on the internet, and they go, wow, I'm going to do that. And then they think that's the only way to do it. And the philosophy of FileMaker is about really knowing FileMaker and knowing what it can do and what features can overlap. And so in this case, the really cool thing is you've already seen it. You know, if you need the tabs to disappear, if you need something like this, then you need this technique. But it's a lot of extra work that I don't have to do with the tab control. So if I don't need those panes to appear and disappear, then why would I do all the work with scripts, calculations, object naming, hide object, interface work possibly, and think about it. When you go into layout mode, do you want to keep on showing the navigation dots? Maybe, maybe not. Or you can come in here and say, okay, well, I'm going to go to 3 and then go to layout mode, and then I can edit that pane. You know, it just makes it a couple more steps. And if you're editing the stuff a lot, those couple extra steps really make a difference and make it. It's kind of the same thing when you do kind of when you make and I lost my train of thought because I saw that question come up, so I'm going to skip it. Let's go ahead and talk about this a little bit and see what we've got here. Were there any stuff that came through, Eric or Steve? Or am I just here by myself? Do I have to unmute
No.
people? Go ahead.
Yeah, we got one from Eric Wegweiser. He says, I might add a trigger that when category changes to personal, while the two tab is visible, that it would reselect a more appropriate tab.
True. Good point. Yeah. And there's also a possibility of you losing sync on these. So if I go to a different layout now, and I'll simulate it by just going to layout mode, you see how this is still highlighted, and now you're actually on one. And, you know, there's ways around this, and it complicates it, and you can go ahead and put a global field and set that, and you'll see that there's an option here. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Apparently Command L does something in WebEx that I'm not don't want it to happen. But you can come in here sorry, on the button bars, and you can choose what the active segment is. You can even specify. So a lot of people on, you know, and I haven't done this in an actual solution, but we'll come in here and specify a global field or another field, and that will allow you to determine what the active segment is. But that's a lot of work. And one of the things about the philosophy of FileMaker is trying to simplify your code. I've gotten a lot of files that I've had to work on where people over-programmed it, over-engineered it. And yes, sometimes engineering and doing some sophisticated stuff works, but sometimes it's best just to stick with the simple stuff. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with this, a lot of things to get around. And that's what I love about FileMaker, is that it's more of a Swiss Army knife. Like usually when a Microsoft solution comes out, they add a menu item, and those features don't necessarily work together very well. Well, FileMaker is that kind of thing where everything kind of works together. You take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 features like we just did, and you make something happen that Claris never really intended to happen. So I'm totally open to comments if people have comments. It doesn't have to be just a question. So go ahead.
Yeah, Jeremy Brown and Tony White have some comments. Maybe they could speak.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Eric, you said why does everyone seem to like slide controls over tab controls? And I don't know if this is true. I swear I heard it long ago that slide controls don't render the data in the other controls until it's visible, but tabs do render everything. Has anybody heard that?
You know, it's the same for both tabs and slide controls. That you're talking about maybe like an unstored calculation.
Yeah.
You can hide it on either. If the tab's not showing, it's not going to calculate that unstored calc.
Okay.
Yeah, no, a very interesting point and a good point to make, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because that is an important thing. If you're got some stuff on there, you know, that you don't necessarily want to calculate every time somebody's walking through the records, you can hide it under a slide control or tab control, and it won't calculate. And there's a variety of other things you can do like that.
So I'll jump in and say I like this presentation, and John, I like the way that you've laid it out. I think we use this technique here, like once. It's a bit rusty in my head, but I do remember, like you say, there's a lot of work, but I think often it's worth it if the client wants it. FileMaker Go, right? So you've got the swipe, and then we're clicking on the tabs, and an alternate thing that might happen is somebody swipes on the panel. So I put in the little chat log here, on panel switch, which is a script trigger, which pairs with the get trigger functions, of which there's 2. And I know that there's some code that could be written in that. I wouldn't go into it, but I just threw it in the chat. I know Eric picks up the chats for later, so people can dig in a quiet time and try and get that all working. So you swipe a panel and go, and the button bar updates, including the active segment. But that goes beyond anything I'm going to say right now.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. There's all kinds of things you have to accommodate when you switch to this technique that you don't have to do necessarily with the tab control, because the tab control has essentially the buttons connected to it. They're already working together. And I just wish that still that somebody at Claris is listening there and would make it so that we can have, hide object on a tab control, not just on these newfangled buttons. In fact, there's a lot of things I want to, they need to retroactively go back and set these things up. I know they're trying to go into the future, but it would be really helpful if I could have a regular button that could have a calculated value in it. There's all kinds of things I'd like to do that they put on the new controls, but not otherwise. Don't forget find mode considered. Tell me what you got there, Eric. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I just mean that this should work similarly or not work, depending on what you need to do, if you're in find mode. So, for instance, in find mode, you might want it to totally display all the tabs, or conversely, you might want find mode to show it a whole different set of tabs.
True. Yeah, it's you have to think of all the parameters that are involved with this. And the tab control is certainly simple and straightforward. When you get into a technique like this, you really have to think through it, and you're going to do a lot of extra work. But, I probably won't use this very often just because, it's that much extra work. And if my client doesn't really need it, then I won't even offer it, because it's going to make my work difficult. I mean, going into, just going between browse mode and layout mode, that's caused me on this complicated solution. I wish I could show it to you, but I can't really. And it's caused me so much trouble since switching from the tab control to the slide control. It just makes the work so much more. But if you need it, and you have to do it.
I like this idea. I'm going to try to find out. I know I've got some ideas for where it might go, but I'm going to look right away and see where I've got tabs that really don't have to be there.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's a great technique. It's just, I just don't want everybody to go, oh, get rid of tab controls. There's no good anymore. Let's just use slide controls and button bars. That's, I guess, my whole point about this is that I think somebody a couple of weeks ago told me, I think it was the guy, I think it was Michael, who told me this. He said, oh, I don't use tab controls anymore. You should only use this technique. And I thought about it. I'm like, wow, I appreciate you telling me about it, but I don't agree with that at all. So I do thank Michael profusely for pointing this out to me. Don't get me wrong. But I think this is one of those things on your tool belt, and this is part of the philosophy of FileMaker. I talk about the tool belt all the time. You got to get a lot of tools on that tool belt. You've got to get a lot of experience in there so you know which tool to pull out to do that job just right. And I think a lot of people forget about that, and they learn one thing and they're a one-trick pony. And that's kind of what I'm trying to teach at my blog and my videos and things like that, is just, try and learn as much. You'll never, right away, the first year you're doing FileMaker or the first 5 years, you may not know everything, but just keep your mind open. I kept my mind open for this technique, and that's how I learned it. So if I can pass that along to some of the people who are coming up in the FileMaker market, make sure you learn the history of FileMaker. It's important, because why did things come into play? Why are these things here? you know, what are we doing these things for? And actually, one of these things we're going to cover here is going to be, I think, something eye-opening, at least for some people. So I kind of planned on a half an hour. I don't want to cut off anybody who has a comment or a question. I appreciate comments more than questions, actually, but because I don't know everything.
Hey, John Mark Beverly. Before we had slide panels and before we had button bars, there was kind of a trick where you would put a smaller tab panel on top of the tabs. And in there, it had one big tab, which basically, with the styling, you didn't see that it was a tab, but within the body part of it, it was very narrow. You'd put your buttons, and those buttons could hide individually, conditionally. And so what you had laying on top of your big tab panel was the set of buttons. It was kind of a hack for the button bars that we have now, but it was very easy to kind of move that out of the way. Then you still had access when you're designing to get to your lower tab panel with the real tab.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you brought that up, because I mean, when I got into the FileMaker market, I was the tips and tricks guy, because back then you had to have a tip and a trick to do anything in FileMaker.
Exactly.
You really had to. It's not so much anymore. I mean, I wouldn't call this a trick or a tip in any way. I think it's a combination of features. I mean, you know, that work well together. But yeah, we did all kinds of crazy things back in the FileMaker 2, even as far, even up until 7, we still, you know, all kinds of tricks. 7 kind of changed things, you know. I think FileMaker grew up in 7, and it's still continuing to grow up. And so now I wouldn't call myself the tip and trick guy. I've kind of grown up with the market, and I've learned relational design and stuff like that. It's a whole different world, I think. Okay, so let's get rid of this stuff. This one's not gonna be available for download, so going into the trash here. Okay, so let's see what else we got. I think the next one on my list is transactional processing. Now, why would it say that I can't share files? That is not good. I do not want that. Okay, because we're gonna need to do that here. Now, I first learned about this from Todd Geist. Really cool technique. And I've been meaning to write about it for years and years and years and years. And I finally wrote about it because 2 reasons. One is it's really cool technique, but also I like to talk about record locking, because I remember when I first started teaching classes, I used to teach over at the Wedge at Claris. They would let me use their training room. And there was a guy in the front row, I mean, real serious student, just literally taking every word down that I said. And I started talking about record locking, and his face just went white. It was actually in terms of saving found sets of records, and he had no idea that it wouldn't work in a multi-user scenario. And so I taught him how to do it the right way. And so that's kind of why I want to talk about transactional processing, because I like to talk about record locking. And the first thing I like to talk about is the actual record locking. And I think a lot of people know what it is, and a lot of people will probably be able to offer some ideas here and some different ways of looking at it, because it's not just simple definition. I mean, there is a simple definition for it, but how record locking plays and how it interacts with everything is different. And one of the ways you can find out, and I hope this works, is I tried it out, it should be working. I may have to quit FileMaker, we'll see, is you can actually test record locking without a server. And a lot of people don't know this, and it's broken over the years. And I safe to say I'm the guy who reported the bugs, because I use this all the time on my classes, because this is great. So you can share, and hopefully it's not going to give me an error. It didn't. Good. And we can come in here and go to hosts, go down to the bottom here. I don't know why it shows 2. That's a bug. There we go. We got a second version of transactional processing open now. You can see one says John Mark's Mac Mini, and one's the original here, right? So now you technically have a guest on the same machine. And it can be very helpful if you don't have access to a server. I know some of the big firms, they do all their work with big teams of on servers and stuff like this. But for some people who are just starting out, and building on their own, and they don't have all the budget for a server and things like that, this is a great way to check record locking. So you can come in here and you can come in and say, okay, well, let me go ahead and edit this. Now, just clicking into this field does not lock that record. Notice we're on the same one, and I can come over here and edit it, right? It's only when I actually edit this, and I could do it either way, but if I come in and edit it, now come back here and try to edit this, it's going to give you an error message saying somebody else is modifying it. Now, record locking doesn't mean you can't get at the information. You can find the information. You can look at the information. You can output it. You can do anything you want. You just can't edit it or delete that record once somebody's locked it. So it's an important concept to understand. Now, it goes much further than that, and it's always best, and that's why I do this, so you can demonstrate it. And sometimes I demonstrate it to myself. I go, I forget how that works. Let me try it out. So you can do a lot of things to cause record locking, like come in here and say, okay, we'll put in a 9 here, right? Does that record lock this? Yes, it does. Even though they're in different tables, because it's on that layout, that portal has locked that record. You got to kind of think of that related table, because it's got a portal on that layout, they're all together right now. So it's important to understand how record locking works. And it's important to understand that global fields can be used to subvert record locking. In other words, you can have an interface with global fields and not get record locking to happen. In fact, let me go ahead and show you real quick. I don't have a global field in here, but let's add one. So we'll go into manage database. I go into video training mode and stop using keyboard commands when I think I'm presenting. So I know you guys don't need to see that. So let me just come in here. And actually, we already have one. So we have the X instructions. We can use that. So if I come over here, edit this, and then try to come over here and edit this one, not a problem, right? It's a global field. So that's one way to get around record locking if you want to. Now, I would want to stop here and see if there's any questions, but more importantly, probably some comments about weird little record locking scenarios that you guys are probably thinking of. And I would love to share those if you guys want to, if anybody has a comment. None? Wow, that's surprising. Eric says, Vince? Open, well, yeah, it's a good point to point out what's the proper way to script access to a record. You don't want to come in here and do a set field and say, set this to the same thing, or cut it and paste it in here. Use open record request. If you say open record request, you're either going to get an error 301 back, or you're going to get an error of 0 back. And if you get in, once you do that, if you get an error 0 back, you're also gaining control of that record without modifying it at all. It's the opposite of commit records. So good point. Thanks for mentioning that. And for some reason, this is hiding. I didn't see what Dennis said. I apologize. I tried to read it. It's for some reason hiding behind stuff when it comes up. Did you want to say that out loud, Dennis? I don't know if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, I'll just unmute myself to tell you. If you're using the replace command to put a value into a found set of records, you'll get a message that tells you that some of them weren't able to be updated, or maybe just one, but it doesn't tell you which one.
Absolutely, great point. And this is a great segue into what I'm going to be talking about. What happens in what we have here? Let me go ahead and close this. Well, actually, yeah, I'll keep this. I can open it up anytime I want, but I'm going to zoom it out there. What we have here is an invoicing solution. And I think this is the same way Todd demonstrates it. And I'll just show you what the tables are: invoices, products, lines, no customers, don't need them. And so, you see you have the one-to-many relationship and the one-to-many, in other words, a many-to-many with a join table. Classic design, I'm not going to go over it a lot. It's very simple and straightforward. And the reason for it, of course, is that you can sell the same product, let's say a widget, many times to many different people. So therefore, what lines contains is a record for every time you sold that widget or any product. And so it's the classic way to design something, but a lot of people also want inventory leveling. They want to have that quantity taken out of inventory. So back in products, if you take a look at it, you'll see that we have 100s. This is the field that has the current quantity, right? And if we come over here and do the incorrect inventory leveling, it will actually work right now. If we go back over here, so we had a 9 and a 5, right? I won't try to remember what it is, but you can see it's removed it from there, right? And put 100 back in here just to reset it again. And if we come back in here and do it what I would call the correct way, the transactional processing way, you get exactly the same results, right? But what a lot of people don't think about is record locking. And what's the best way to do it? And there's not one way to get around record locking. There really is not. This transactional processing thing, I rarely use it. I'm not saying it's not a really cool technique and has its place, but it's like the conditional tabs. Use the right technique, and I'll show you quickly another technique on another way to do it. So don't be a one-trick pony. Don't think this is the only way to get around record locking. Let's take a look at what we've got here. Real simple. Again, I've kept these very simple. Here's the incorrect way. I do a go to related record because the relationship is already there. And then I simply loop through those records and use what I call the pull technique, because I'm right now when I go to related record, I'm in line. So I'm in here, I'm using this value, but pulling from inventory here. Okay, I apologize. I got that. No, I got that right. Okay, I thought sometimes my brain left and right get mixed up and one starts controlling the other one. So I've had overthink myself. But anyhow, it's pretty basic. The problem here is, what if somebody's over in products editing the description of one of those things? In other words, let's go back and get this guy here. Go over to products and let's get the widget. And I'm just going to say that, just put widgets in there. Now what happens with this? Okay, looks like it worked okay. Well, I have set error capture on, that's why. But you can see right now that it didn't level it, right? And you're thinking, well, that's no big deal. I can just go back and do that at a later time. Well, the issue is that what if you have 100 records to level? 100 product records, or maybe it's a totally different solution. There's many more and so you're zooming along, either doing like the gentleman said, I forgot his name, doing a replace, which just tells you afterwards that it didn't work. Or if you're doing a loop, at least you can test as you're going along. But what do you do then? When you hit a locked record, what do you try to do? Do you go on with the rest of it and then try to come back and do that one and see if it's unlocked? What if it never becomes unlocked? What if the guy went to lunch? It's definitely not a solution that's ever going to work properly. And the way to get around that is with Todd's great technique, transactional processing. Now, typically, I've always told people in the past, don't loop through a portal, but here's a perfect scenario for looping through a portal. Let me demonstrate why. Let's go ahead and change this to a 1 and change this to a 1. And then put in Database Pros 2, right? I've changed a whole bunch of stuff, not only in the local fields, but in the portal. If I come over here and revert the record, not only does the master record, the parent record revert, it also reverts the portal and every record in there. So now we've got a technique where we can go through this portal, and if we hit a snag, we can change everything back to the way it was and tell the person you can't level inventory right now, or you can do whatever you want at that point. You have choices here. You haven't messed up the data is what it comes down to. I don't know if there's one solution out there, what you do once you hit it, but this prevents you from screwing up. And it's pretty simple. You simply go to that portal row, go to the portal first, go to that object, select that portal, go to the next portal row, do the same technique of setting, removing it, and then check for errors. Okay, I check for no records in that portal because we don't want an endless loop. But here's really the check we're looking for. you check to see if there's a 301. You could check to see if there's any error other than 0 if you wanted to, just to catch everything, because there could be validation errors, all kinds of different kinds of errors. But if you're checking for record locking, it's 301. And once you do that, you revert the record, and you say can't do leveling right now, and you're done. An awesome technique. Questions about it? Comments about it? Have you guys ever used this technique before? So quiet. I think Jeremy's probably writing a whole bunch of notes because like, Todd never told me this. Just kidding, Jeremy.
Actually, well, I mean, this is the way that we use it. This is the way that we do stuff here at Geist Interactive all the time. Todd is very insistent that this is how we process multiple records all the time. So he's gone so far as to say, and I've written about this before, but if you're not using this method in a time when you're processing multiple records, then your system is broken, or it could break very easily and cause problems. So, yeah.
I absolutely would not disagree with him. I think he's absolutely right. I think that it's either don't process multiple records while there's people online, or use this technique. There's really not much of a choice, really, honestly. But there are other record locking issues that you can get around in different ways, and that's my whole point. This is definitely, I agree. What I try to do is avoid processing multiple records if I can.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else got a comment? Go ahead.
On my end, I wanted to say I did some transactional processing last summer, and it was a first for me. And it's really a different mindset, and it really lets you do things that you're not able to do otherwise. But there are a fair number of gotchas along the way. So I think there's a lot of material that's available out there, especially from Geist Interactive in blog posts and demo files. I would say definitively go and look at the content into the Carbon framework. Some great things in there. And what else was there? Oh, I wish there was a way to, like we discussed about the open record. I wish there was a way to open a record across a relationship. And I think that's all I would say.
Good points. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think a lot of people have used this technique, and if you haven't, here it is. It's pretty cool. Any other comments?
I've got a couple. I think that there's two issues here. One, the concept of transactions, where you're updating data in two different tables, and you want to have a complete success for both tables, let's say, or a complete failure. Bank balances being transferred is kind of a classic example. And then the other that I saw a client implement was addressing this idea that you're updating inventory, or to use your words, John, leveling inventory, where you might have a failure because somebody's editing the product description, for example. So it wasn't me, but someone implemented that by having a queue of records where the inventory updates were posted to a queue that was run by a robot. And the robot would attempt to post the update. And if it failed, it would just run on a loop, and it would, continue to try until it updated. And that seemed to work out well for them.
Or you could schedule something in the middle of the night too. Just wait for the processing, the leveling of the inventory till the nighttime, as long as you're comfortable with it being 24 hours old.
Yeah, you could do that. This was, they had 130 people. And so they were, just real time in it. And it was, they had old Macs sitting around just chugging away. Or they actually won, just running the queue.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is in a lot of people, and Darren Southern, and we talked on the podcast about this, and I say things differently than him, and if he wants to comment and say, hey, that's not what I meant, feel free to comment, Darren. But we talked about the UX, and the which is the user experience, and how you need to find out what people are doing what their job is in order to provide them the proper experience. And so this plays into this whole processing of, let's say, inventory. Do they need to have their inventory, processed right then? Can they wait 24 hours? Well, if it wait 24 hours, you don't need this technique. There's all kinds of different things you need to find out and question them, and not just go, oh, I've heard about this inventory leveling, I know exactly what you want, and then you stop listening to the customer. I think that's part of what I got from Darren about a small part of what the user experience is. I don't know if you want to say anything, Darren.
That's exactly the point, John. Is you have a function that needs to solve a problem, and if you're just thinking that every problem is the same across all clients, then you're going to get some upset customers. So absolutely find out how they're using it. Find out if they do need to go into multiple records in that portal and change quantities and change the name before you put a feature into the system that either restricts or allows it. And yeah, absolutely, queue things up if that's the way the workflow. You're there to make the user's job easier, not just to provide what you provided to the previous client. Absolutely, John.
Yep. Don't try to put a square peg in a round hole kind of thing. Excellent. Any more comments about, go ahead and talk, Jeremy. I'm fine with people unmuting themselves. Use that space bar if you want.
I was just trying to think if there is a way to open up records across relationships. There has to be. Otherwise, you can't edit records. You can't edit records via a transaction, which you can do. Couldn't you just loop through the portal and open the record? That would open the parent record multiple times. There's got to be a way. I have not done that a whole lot, but
it might be a little sloppy, but I think you're probably right. There's some way you probably could do it by opening up a whole bunch of windows or something like that.
I'll be happy to hear about that, because I couldn't find anything that would do so without editing the actual record. If you provoke an edit, then of course the record is then open. But if you just want to open it without the edit, so that if you revert, so that you can revert without losing. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting lost there. But
what's the point of opening it if you're not going to make any changes to it?
Because you got to grab it. You got to make sure you own it
it's
before
to make
you
sure
edit.
that the data is not going to change as you are reading from multiple records.
Yeah. You want to take ownership of every record that you intend to edit before you actually edit them.
And in the end, you have other things that you need to change. So you need your full transaction to commit. You cannot roll it back. So that's why you can't release all the records and say revert. You need the commit to go. But if the commit goes, then you don't want those first records to be edited.
My understanding is you loop a portal.
Sorry.
You loop a portal and you run the open record from the context of being inside the portal. But I would test that at home, but that's what I vaguely remember from a few years ago. Go into the portal and open record runs from the context. So you preemptively open everything and then you do your commit. But anyway, test that. Could be wrong.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, interesting conversation. Keep going. Go ahead.
Hey,
Vince.
while we're on the topic, so we brought up the replace, right? And I seem to remember that if you run replace, it does it in batches as if it's a transaction. John Mark, do you know anything about that? Like,
Yeah, I think it's about 500.
is it do you know the exact number? 500? I thought it was 25 is a lower number. Like
25 is the number
records
of
at a
related number of records that FileMaker loads from server, but that's my recollection of 25. So
okay, so meaning that if you're running a replace, and you're over a network, like even though you're getting like into the records aren't changing one at a time. They're kind of getting clumped together. And then it's saying, okay, here's 25 records. go and replace them. But yeah, I'm not sure about it. I was wondering if anybody knew the exact number and mechanics of it.
Where's Darren Terry when you need him?
Yeah, well, as another, I know the 25 comes
Yeah.
from the fact that if you're in form view, you'll load 25 records at a time, or list view, depending on how the WAN's operating. But if you were to do a replace field contents on 200 records, I'm pretty sure they will get multiple modified timestamps from when you start to when you finish, if the process does take, say, 12 seconds.
Well,
And they are done as a batch, but if one fails, the other 499 will still get committed. You'll just get a message back to say, no, you've only received one of these, and you don't know which one it is. So in a pure transactional model, the loop is superior to the replace field contents, because you do need to find out which record wasn't actually updated in that process.
Yep.
Also, if you have error capture turned on, you won't even see that you had a failure.
You can still do a get last error after the process to find out if there was an error, rather than publishing it to the user. Because once the user does get an error to say, one out of your 499 records was changed, we don't know which one, what would you like to do? Continue. I don't know a situation where a user would know what to do and what button to press with the standard FileMaker dialogues. Again,
In that situation, yeah.
So I actually did look this up, because I had written about this before. The way that I've learned it from being here at Geist Interactive is, if you're using a portal to edit records, you simply go to the parent record and start looping through the portal. You open the parent record, then you loop through the portal. You go ahead and change the data like someone suggested. I think it was Robert. And if you ever get an error, then you have to dump out right away, because you can't continue on if you try to change data, like add the discount to the third line item and that's being edited by someone else. You just have to revert and say, nope, we can't do this transaction right now. So you're right, we don't have to open them specifically. We just try to edit them and see if we get an error every loop pass.
You might want to open it instead of changing data, so you don't get a superfluous modification of the child record.
I'm not convinced that you can open up a child record. I have to try it. I think you mentioned that. I'm not sure you can open it up in a portal, because it would just open up the parent record, even if you're in, I don't know. I'm just guessing, but I'm going to give it a try right now.
It will always open the parent record. If you open a child record, it opens the parent record in addition to the child record. So that's natural.
And
behavior.
You could use get open record count, I think, would increment.
Well, let's see here. So
I'm pretty sure we had a situation in the last week where we were testing this, and there was no way to open the child record without editing it.
Yeah.
Let's test.
But again, I agree with Jeremy. I don't think you need to open the child records. Like if you're looping through the portal records and you need to update like 3 or 4 of them, or maybe all of them, if any of them are locked, you just revert. Nothing gets committed.
Yeah.
So you don't have to go and open every single record.
Yeah. That's
well. If you don't need to edit every single record in the portal, then you would then be editing records that you don't need to edit. So you'd be triggering timestamps. If you had a modification date, you'd be triggering it. So if you open it to prevent that from being, messed with, but these may be fine points, but I'm going to test it over here.
Fine points are great. How about we table this till the end? We'll have some Q&A at the end and discussion and stuff, and move on to the last one. And then I'm sure you guys will have all figured out, you process this a little bit better and tried some examples at home, and we can talk about it again. And then we'll get we'll get a better discussion, I think, at that point.
And then we'll all agree.
Yeah, right.
Could happen.
It could happen. You're right.
Once
in a blue moon. So So what I want to talk about next is ExecuteSQL. And not that I'm going to teach you really much about ExecuteSQL here, but I'm going to teach you about when you might want to use it. I think that's the biggest issue. I mean, I spend a fair amount of time on the forums, the FileMaker community, and I see people offering every single time ExecuteSQL as a solution. And I'm not saying it's not a great thing, but we need to first understand, and people may not know this, why ExecuteSQL was added. It was added to declutter the relationship graph, because people were adding relationships and table occurrences to do things that, honestly, that were just one thing that they wanted to do. They only had one reason. There was maybe not even a portal there. There was no related field. There's no script writing over that. They just wanted to go ahead and one little time in one situation, small situation, grab some data from another table. So when I use ExecuteSQL, there's a lot of ways I use it, and I'm definitely not even close to being an expert. But I find probably one of the best scenarios is a preferences situation, because often you need those preferences from 10 or 12 or 20 or 100 tables. And do you want to have a relationship to the table that has those preferences, or as I'll call the other things options? I'll explain those. Do you want to have all those table occurrences? If you had one from every table of 100 table solution, because you need that preference no matter where you were, do you want to make all those relationships, all those table occurrences? No, that's why ExecuteSQL was introduced. It's not the fastest kid on the block. That's not really its skill set. Its skill set is not adding clutter, not adding any schema for just one tiny little feature. So when you think about that and understand again that there's many ways to accomplish the same thing. I'm not saying sometimes I don't use relationships and table occurrences for certain things, but in the case of preferences, it works pretty well. So let's take a look what I've got here. It's not very complicated. There's two tables for the solution, and then there's a preferences table which has one record for each account. And there's a script I may go over, may not, that is pretty simple, but on opening, it checks to see if the person's in preferences. If they're not, the current account that's logging on. If they're not, then it adds them into it so they can have their own preferences. There's defaults that are set. And so when they go into preferences, they can set their own settings that they want. Now, options is a little bit different. It's like preferences, but it's for everybody. There's only one record in there. So that'd be something like, maybe you have a company logo, company address, and things like that you want to display somewhere. Prefs is more like, hey, I don't want to start up on the same layout every time. I want to choose which layout I start. The salespeople want to start off on this layout, and the accounting people want to go to this layout as their starting point. All kinds of things could be in there. I'm sure a lot of you out there have done that. And I used to do it by adding relationships. Boom, boom, everywhere. I would add so many relationships. But as you can see, there's no relationships to prefs and options right here because I don't need it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over and use ExecuteSQL to get that information. There's a few little tricks and things like that. But when I do ExecuteSQL, because I don't do it that often and I don't want to be an expert, I have a little piece of snippet of code that I grab. I think it's right inside here, my custom function here. I think this one does a pretty good job of it. Just a little select statement, because this is mostly what I do right here. I might add in a little find like I do in preferences here, and use some arguments and things like that. But for the most part, it's pretty simple stuff because I'm just trying to go over and get one piece of information. So if I demonstrate how this works so you can get an idea, and this is not the only way to do it, but I decided to try to make it all in one screen. So when I hit preferences, it goes over, looks who the current account is, finds their preferences, and then puts them into all these global fields. It's not the only way to do it, but I want to do like a one screen kind of thing here. And so if I change this and then save it and then come back in, that preference will still be there. It's writing it every single time. And you can see it's just some different preferences here. You can see some options here, which would be an address, something like that. So it's not very difficult to do. What you need to understand about ExecuteSQL is that, okay, so yeah, so text expander is a handy way to write this. Yeah, for the average guy, in what I usually teach is to people who are budding FileMaker developers, they're probably not going to have any of those tools. I just write mine inside the data viewer usually. And what I do is I copy and paste that basic code and then change a little bit so I don't have to deal with all the syntax. I go, oh yeah, I forgot I have to have a semicolon here, or I have to quote here, or whatever. I don't want to remember that stuff because I don't use it very often. But when I do, it's because it's going to save me. It's going to be that tool on my belt that's, it's way in the back, but I pull it out and it's just perfect for this job. And so it's pretty simple what happens here. Oh, I gotta stop doing that. Command L does something different in WebEx. So you'll see that on this popover, I have it running an initialize script. I do this quite a bit. Same thing with options. Oops, gotta make sure you double click on it and then command double click on it. And then there's another one. It's both really the same script. Very simple. Just simply comes over here. We look at the script. It simply says, go over there and grab this information using these custom functions I showed you before, which are ExecuteSQL. So we have the preferences. All I do is I specify the field name in quotes. That's how my custom function works. And it grabs that value out of there. Same thing with options, except there's a different query. There's no query because there's only one record. So if we look at that custom function here, first at the options, which is really, Command L. Sorry. Yeah, I'm trying not to do it. So here you can see it's very simple. And often what I do is I'll take this, and I don't know if you guys do this, but I don't have one of those fancy tools for doing this, but I'll come in here when I'm having a problem and paste this in there and monitor what's going on to see what that is. Specified field can't be found, so I put in. So I'll write things like this so I can see, is the syntax correct? Because sometimes you can't really tell from all the calculation you've done, and I'll come in and do that. But it's really simple to do this. You just have to, what I'm doing is, come on, WebEx, get out of my way. I didn't, yeah. Okay, if I ignore it, then it goes away. Okay, good. So what I try to do is what I'm doing is I'm putting the value. This is the parameter inside my custom function going right into where this field is. And that's how it says select this field from options. Now, if we do the same thing with preferences, it's just a little bit more complicated. It does basically the same thing, but it does a where in there where it says account crate equals ? And what I'm doing is I'm taking the current account name. SQL is case sensitive, unlike FileMaker finds. So I have to lower it. In fact, when I create inside preferences, if we go over to preferences here, you'll see when I create the account name, I believe this is the right one here. It also uses the lower function so we can make sure no matter, because I don't know if you guys have realized, you probably have, but when you sign on, the account name is not case sensitive, and it remembers it the way you typed it in. So if you do admin with a capital A or do it all lowercase, that's the way it's going to come across with the get account name, and you got to watch out about that. So this lower function is very, very important on this. Very important to do this. And so the save button works essentially the same way. I'll just show it real briefly. There's the pref save. We just make sure I just do a simple approach to it. Go over to the layout, enter fine mode. You could open a new window, whatever you want to do, but it's very simple. Just take those values, put them over back into there. They're in global field, so I just set them into that particular record. Options is a little bit easier because I don't have to do a find. I just go over there and do it. So a perfect, in my opinion, way to use ExecuteSQL. Let's hear some comments about things. I'd like to hear what people have done, how they've used ExecuteSQL. I didn't see what Dennis said. It went by so fast. A time saver, he said. But feel free to unmute yourself at this.
I'll tell you what it is. I find it really annoying when you're using the SMTP server settings to have to enter those 8 parameters time after time after time. But if you have 8 custom functions already written, or you can run one script that sets 8 global variables, it just makes it real quick to make those script steps for using the SMTP server.
Absolutely, I've run into the same problem. I've done the same thing. I always use the variables, not the custom function, but I'll have to take a look at the custom function. That might be interesting.
I always try to use something that has the same word with the global variables and just 8 repetitions of the same global variable, so I can just paste it 8 times and change the number in the bracket. That makes it a little faster. It would be really nice if you could save a script step and then use that script step again and again instead of having to write it every time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any more comments, or I doubt there's questions, but I hopefully there's some more comments about this stuff. While you guys are thinking up your questions or comments, let me show you something I think is under this tab here. It's a calculated tab. I'm not really covering this whole thing, but one of the things you want to point out is that there are reserved characters and words, and SQL does not like an underscore. It does not like the underscore at the beginning of a field. So this is what, as far as I know, the best way to get it to recognize that underscore and not have to change your naming conventions. Do it like this, and you're able to get it in there. Okay, now people just don't like ExecuteSQL. Go ahead, Bev.
No.
Oh, sorry. Whoever's speaking. Sorry, I thought it was Bev.
Sorry, John. As you've always said, functions within FileMaker are part of your tool belt. And so when you're about to do a feature and you would normally go and drop a relationship on the relationship graph, or you go and do a particular function, spend some time on a different way of doing things like ExecuteSQL and go and say, you know, here is the function using native functions. Here is a function to do an SQL. What are the pros and cons of the 2 methods? Whether you're building a dashboard or a data warehouse or just pulling preferences in, do it more than one way and then decide at the time which is the best option for this particular client's needs.
And eventually, when you compare and contrast these things and have done it both ways, you know what the answer is without actually having to do it. Because you've done it so many times, you realize, oh yeah, should I go ahead and make these records by looping through and making or should I import them from another table? What's listed down in your mind what the benefits, the advantages and disadvantages are, so you can really decide what's going to work best in this situation. Because like we said before, it's not always a round peg into a round, you know, sometimes you've got to change what you're doing. So I see a lot of stuff coming through. I think we're going to have to.
I don't know if you can hear me. I'm going to quickly answer one that was back channel. The guide was said 12, but really there are only like 2 or 3 more additions having to do with the limit of number of records that you query that were added since 12. So if you have the guide, it works really well in 19. Nothing's changed otherwise.
I saw a lot of stuff coming by. Feel free to unmute yourself. Just hit that space bar and hold it down. I'm really not very good at WebEx, so I apologize. I don't know where this stuff's. Someone.
Okay. So here's Eric. So like the old way of doing this was just to go ahead and like open up a new window, find the data, and find some way to gather it and put it somewhere. Is that just too clunky anymore? Or is there a place for that anymore? Or would you always want to use something like ExecuteSQL?
Not necessarily. There's a place for everything. You could also use a relationship to get this information. There's lots of ways to do things. The point is, what's the best way given this unique situation? You can't just say, what I found on the forums a lot was people were taking ExecuteSQL in particular and shoving it onto every solution that every question that everybody asks. Oh yeah, just use ExecuteSQL. And the people would be beginners and they're like, what is this? It's about looking and determining the pros and the cons. Like Darren said, you've got to really look at it and look at all the tools in your belt. Which one can solve this problem the best? And sometimes the old, easy, open up a new window, do a find is the best way to do it.
Off the open up a new window idea, someone had a technique that I picked up on, which is a faceless logic file. In other words, it's a file that doesn't have any fields on any layouts, and it uses the separation model to point to any number of other tables. And so when you call it, it feels very lightweight because you're just basically going to a layout to establish context and either making a new record or pulling data back, like a getter or a setter. And it feels pretty good to me because it's faceless, so it doesn't affect the interface of the file that you're starting off from. I don't know if that all made sense, but a faceless logic file that you can
How do you make
set against.
this?
What's that?
How do you make it faceless?
You just don't put any. It's a super duper simple file that you just don't put any fields on any layouts, and you just call it and say, go to this layout, make a new record, or go to this layout and tell me what the data is.
So my question would be, what would be the difference between doing that in a separate file versus doing it in the same file?
Because the user interface is in the file from which you're originating.
Gotcha.
That's it.
I think
Yep,
also
that makes sense.
I think also the point might be that your main file doesn't get complicated with all those extra table occurrences and relationships, where that faceless worker file might be a better place to do that.
Good point.
Yeah, and this was, I think I heard it from Kent out of New Zealand, who I believe is active in the school market, and I thought that's a really good idea. And I've been using it for a while, and it seems to work. And you only have to go to a layout, and you don't even have to come back, so it feels a little bit less expensive. And you're not popping a window and closing it. You're just going somewhere and doing something, and you're done. Until the next time you call it.
Now, so this is what should be going inside your brain when you're thinking about what should I do. You should be thinking about all the different approaches, and the more you learn about, the more tools you have in your belt, and the more things you can throw out to see what works best.
Yep. Another extension of that idea is that any scripted layout change should be going to a blank layout, unless, of course, you are interacting with a portal or a field. But if you're going to hit a blank layout from your script step and it's in form view, then none of the calculations or the elements on that layout will render, and therefore you'll hit it. And a further extension of that technique is to go into find mode first, then switch layouts to your context, and therefore you're not loading any records at all before you perform your function. So
I use that
thinking about optimizing.
Yeah, I use that find trick a lot when I'm working with a remote device, like an iPad or an iPhone. Really handy to go into find mode so you don't have to pull all those records down if you just want to do a find. First go into find mode, then change the layout, and then put your criteria in and go from there. Okay. So did anybody figure out the answer to our record locking situation? Did we have enough time?
I tested it here. I think you could make a case for both of the approaches that were mentioned. If you're setting data in line items where you're actually setting data in each and every single line item, then just setting it, and then I think what Jeremy said makes a lot of sense. I did a little test here. The open record script step does seem, tested out as operating from the context of a portal line item, because I'm looking at record with 7 portal lines, and I got a record. What's that function? Get open record count, I think it's called. Incremented up to 8. So there may be, use cases for either of the two approaches. One is a little bit, just depending on your data set and what you want to modify and what you don't want to modify. Everybody's right.
Yeah, except when they're wrong.
Or everybody's wrong.
Yeah, right.
It depends. There's only one correct answer. It depends.
Yeah, right.
We can agree on that.
And Tony, I think that's really important when you said it depends. It really does, because it depends on what you're doing, what answer is correct. It's a true statement. So.
Yep.
That and your mileage may vary.
This is where we always talk about context. And there's a podcast about the same name, isn't there, Jeremy?
Is Jeremy with us?
Yep.
He's on mute at the moment.
There is.
So anyhow, that's about the end of my presentation. And I don't know, am I obligated to go till 7:30? I don't think I am. So I think I'm probably done. I'm not sure that, I think this was a good discussion about how, I view development. And I think I've just kind of given it a name. I think a lot of people out there do the same thing. Certainly Darren and I have talked a lot more about it, and about, during the podcast, we'll talk a little bit about this whole idea of just thinking about what you're doing. Really, that's what it comes down to. Don't just regurgitate. Don't just say you found something on the internet. Go ahead. Oh, I thought somebody said something. I apologize. All kinds of beeping and people leaving and stuff. And so, yeah, no, I've got a wife and a dog that, so I don't want to keep everybody else away from their loved ones either. But if there's some points that people want to make, please make them. I'd be glad to entertain it.
Well, for one, you're long overdue at DIGFM, and we should force you to go to 7:30.
You want me to start reading the emails that you wrote me? I have every single one you wrote me. I think Eric thinks I still live in Silicon Valley, so.
JMO, have you ever done transactions without portals? Have you explored that idea?
I generally try to avoid them. And, everybody's got different experience in different databases that they've done. And, there's a whole variety of different ways to handle things. And I have not done in a real client solution any transactional processing.
Okay.
But I'm ready to whenever it comes my way. I've often, it's kind of the same thing as the QuickBooks thing. People often come to me and say, hey, I want my QuickBooks to talk to my FileMaker. And I'm like, okay, well, that's probably going to cost you $3,000 to $5,000. And all of a sudden they don't want to do it anymore. I'm saying, have you ever thought about this? Or, you ask your client, why do you want to do that? And the answer is, yeah, I want to have my data, but you need to have it up to date. Do you need to have every single line item from FileMaker inside of QuickBooks? Maybe not. Maybe you just need to have your expenses in there, and you can put them in once a month, and that can be a report in FileMaker, and you can type it in. So a lot of times I talk people out of complexity if I can. And certainly transactional processing is a cool technique, but it's not always needed. There's a lot of ways around it, other ways to do things.
Can I put in a word for custom functions?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
I find that if there's a solution that's got lots and lots of scripts, and you've got a script step that's, let's say, setting a field with a simple calculation like get current date, you don't really need a custom function for that. But if you've got something that's using a calculation that you've written, let's say creating an invoice number with some complicated calculation, and 6 months later you find that you have to change it, but it exists in 50 different scripts. You don't want to have to go to all of those scripts to change that particular calculation. And if you forget one and somebody's using it, you have errors. But a calculation that's being used often is really a good reason to use a custom function instead of writing it every time.
Yep, centralizing your code.
Hey, Jeremy, you said something a moment ago that was about transactions. Transactions without portals. That's interesting. Would that be like popping multiple windows if you had?
No. No, it's part of the Carbon framework. It's the only way that I've learned how to do transactions when I joined Geist Interactive. But I mean, I know how to do it now with portals. But
okay.
It's just creating a auto create relationship from the parent to the child table, and then you can actually use that. You can actually it's using the magic key method. It's that pass back or whatever that Kevin Frank calls it, that other people have talked about. But it's using that method to create records. And you could actually, if you had one invoice and 10 invoice line items, you could actually create all 10 invoice line items, and you could have 11 records open, but there's no portal that you're looping through. It's just held in FileMaker's memory, in your computer's memory, until you commit the parent, and then all those children are committed as well. So
that's good. Yeah, no, thank you. That jogged my memory. And yeah, it is in the Carbon framework. And I did look at that. A lot of interesting stuff in that. I didn't look at it all, but there's a lot of good stuff in there.
But the way that JMO shows here is good as I understand, because you can actually watch it happening versus it all happening in FileMaker's memory. So I actually prefer portals most of the time, because you can see it there. So
yeah, readability.
Back to what you were saying about
readability. Just a little comment before it. Just readability. I mean, just simple example. I write all my find scripts: enter find mode, set field, perform find. I never use restore ever because of readability. But go ahead.
What you said about centralizing code. If you have like multiple file solutions that are on the same server, some of them are interrelated or not related in either case, but you end up using the same custom functions over multiple solutions. Is there a way to centralize that, or is it you're pretty much stuck in putting it, a copy in each file?
Script functions. Sometimes that can help. Script functions. That's what Darren Terry calls them. You pass in something. I mean, you pass in 0 or many parameters. You perform some sort of calculation or loop or whatever, and you echo back a result.
That's right. I remember you presenting on that.
It doesn't fit every single use case. And the other kind of crazy thought is you call up Nick and ask him to build it into base elements, and then it's application wide. But yeah, script functions, custom functions, so many choices.
Any other comments or questions or anything? I mean, feel free to voice.
Yeah, this is Jim Branham. I have a couple of techniques that sort of combine several that you're talking about tonight, primarily to address the record locking situation. I have one database I support that involves live event management, best way I could describe it. And what happens there is you try to limit it to only one person at a particular data entry function, but quite often more than one will turn up on the same data entry layout. And so part of the transactional is I actually set up using popovers to expose the data entry globals, and then the save button will then enable the saving of the record. I think I'm going to add another technique based on what I heard tonight, which is checking to see if the record is free to be able to open up that portal, either using the script trigger you can attach to the popover, or not portal, but the popover, attach the opening script to see if the record's available, or at the very least, when hitting the save or the commit button from the globals that appear on the popover, to check that the record is available, and probably loop through a couple of times just to avoid the save situation where you could have two people trying to interact with it. But setting up a semaphore so that that popover doesn't open would be even better. But we have had a number of cases where people try to climb over each other. The other case is we have, say, an event taker inner and a dispatcher of resources that both need to see related records from the initial event and what the dispatch actions are. We actually use the ExecuteSQL to replicate the data fields that need to be seen by both groups, and it avoids the record locking that we were getting with simple FileMaker relationships. And those are triggered calcs that will refresh things. Say where we tried to use classic FileMaker relationships, you'd end up either with circular references or you'd get the parent, some sort of parent-child kind of thing going on just because the relationships are bidirectional. So anyway, a couple of uses that we found for both of those techniques.
Thanks for sharing. That was great. Thanks.
Also, John, just want to say somewhere in your presentation you said you used to be the guy about tips and tricks, and tips and tricks may not be part of the product as much as they used to be. We may not be relying on it as much, and I think you put the marker around version 7, but I want to say that there's a trick that I credit to you or attribute to you, and if I'm wrong, you let me know. But until hide object when was introduced into FileMaker 13, I believe, I was heavily relying on the portal hiding trick, like having this relationship dedicated to just hide or show something on the layout. And you're the first person that I heard this tip from. So so it like from 7 to 13, there's a good couple years there where that was very useful.
No doubt. I'll tell you a little story kind of to end this whole thing about how I found out about that technique, because I didn't come up with myself, but this is I tell this and I'm not going to mention names, but I tell this story because this is not the way I view life or anything. But somebody, and I really honestly don't even remember their name, just before a developer conference where I had been scheduled to speak, sent me a file over the email and said, essentially, neener, I bet you don't know how to do this. And I wrote him back and said, I don't know how to, this is really cool. And this is the thing you're talking about. And he literally for a week and a half never got back to me. So what I did after a week and a half is I just thought about how did he do this? Oh, look at that thing's highlighting. What highlights? Oh, and so I figured out it was a one-row portal, a calculation, and it's been so long since I did it. I think those are the two items: calculation, one-row portal, and a relationship. Yeah, and that would, and so I presented that at DevCon. And this guy was, I actually, I've skipped part of the story. I figured it out and I sent him the file back, and that's when he finally responded to me. I'm like, that's not the way the FileMaker market works. It's a community and people share, and the more you share, the more you learn, the more you really honestly learn. And I always remember that story. I'm like, I don't ever want to be like that guy. And it's funny because even at the DevCon that I presented at, and I don't know, did anybody ever go to that? Do they remember what I was wearing at that DevCon? Because it was very unique. I was wearing a suit, so I stood out like a thumb. It's because I'd never presented before, and I was so afraid. And my friend said, "Wear a suit," so I wore a suit, and I was the only guy with the suit the whole time. But I still remember in the audience people coming up and saying, after I presented, they're all, oh yeah, I came up with that idea. 3 or 4 people in the audience said I came up with that idea. It's like, I don't care. It really comes down to, I don't think it matters who came up with it. It matters that we're using it is what it comes down to. So anyhow.
Yeah, you're right, John, because, there's, one of these things I'd heard before in a presentation here, but the fact that you presented again, it was a great reminder, actually, because, sometimes I forget. I don't even use the less. And, later on someone comes and brings it up again and it's, oh yeah, I could use that right now.
That is so true, Eric. So true. So I think we're winding down here. I want to go have some dinner. I don't know about you guys. I haven't had any, but I think we're pretty much done. The download link's been up here if you need it for a while. Again, if you missed it, just email me. I'd be glad to email you the download rather than you have to remember this long URL. So feel free to do that.
What's your email? I guess we should.
Oh, just it's JMO@FileMakerPros.com, DatabasePros.com, PhilosophyOfFileMaker.com, PhilosophyOfCooking.com. You pick and choose.
Okay.
FiresideFileMaker.com.
Apple.com, Google.com.
Yeah, no, not that one.
Awesome.
Yeah, but yeah, feel free. If you don't remember, it's right on my website. I don't hide my email address. You don't have to fill in a form. It's right there. So if you can get to my website, databasepros.com, you're set.
I've heard DevCon in our user groups described as one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread.
Cute.
Yeah.
God, now I'm frazzled because I'm sitting in this hot little room because my wife's over there, another room. I'm in this hot little with a fan right on top of me, and I'm starting to lose it. But Eric, or do you want to end the meeting, or I don't know how this whole thing ends or how it goes?
We just go out on a whimper.
Okay.
Now Steve's there. Steve's going to go ahead and unmute, unless he went off to dinner.
So. Might have gone.
No, I'm still here.
Hey, you're up, Steve.
I'm up. Well, I don't have anything, so my up is stopping it right here.